Um, my name's Dave West. I am here to talk to about incentives, and I'm fortunate to have a colleague of mine alongside Darrell Fernandes. But before we go on and talk about the content and actually go into the real stuff, I just have to make sure, because otherwise I get into trouble, that there's some webinar stuff, logistics. Your microphones will be muted throughout, which is not a surprise. You know, we don't want to hear dogs barking or the Amazon guy arriving. The session is recorded, so if you actually like it and think, oh, you know who we need to send this to, we need to send it to Bob, right? Because Bob always needs a link. So they were recorded, and you'll get a copy in 24 hours of that recording and access to the slides, etc. Ask questions. There's a question Q&A icon that you can see. I'm not sure about the live stream. If you have a Q&A icon there, I have no idea. I've never been in the live stream. But so just click on that, type your little question, etc. We've got people monitoring it. Actually, we've got a person monitoring it, and then when Darrell's speaking or when I'm speaking, one of us will be monitoring it as well. So I guess two people, which is groovy. So okay, all right. You know who we are? Scrum.org, home of Scrum. My boss, Ken Schwaber, the Frank Sinatra of Agile software and agile development approaches. You can imagine, I always say this joke every time, but you imagine what it's like to have Ken Schwaber come to your sprint reviews. Not as much fun as it sounds, I'll tell you that. Our mission, actually, though, we're the home of Scrum, it isn't Scrum. It's about helping people and teams solve complex problems. We do that with training, certification, ongoing learning. Some of you may have seen a new AI class that just hit the street this week. My name's Dave West. I'm the CEO here at Scrum.org. There's my contact details. I don't think you need to know what I do or anything like that. I'm a CEO, which I'm not totally sure what I do, but my actual real passion is product ownership. And I'm also a product owner of many of the products that we provide. That's my contact detail. Feel free to reach out to me, connect to me on LinkedIn. And yes, that is a picture when I was young. Luckily, though, it's not just me talking, because that'd be awfully boring and repetitive. So we have fortunate to have Darrell Fernandes, who I've known for a long time, joining us today. Welcome to the webinar, Darrell.
Thank you, Dave. Excited to be here.
That's great to have you here. And the reason why, actually, I'll tell you a reason why in a minute, but let's just quickly go through some of his credentials. He works with Scrum.org, helping us be smarter, I guess, really, because he was head of product and platform technology. So I know chief product officer, I suppose, at TIA, CIO at Fidelity Investments. And I actually met Darrell, gosh, coming up for what? 17 years ago, something like that.
Almost 20.
Yeah, oh god, I know it's worrying, isn't it? I was at Forrester Research, and we had lunch together talking about agile and practices all those years ago and what they were doing at Fidelity Investments, and we became friends and trusted advisors and the like. He does lots of stuff now. He's sort of retired from the financial services sector, and we're fortunate to have him work with Scrum.org to give us that CIO perspective. Cool. Now, so we'll be hearing from Darrell a lot during this webinar, sort of like the voice of reason, as it were. This webinar is part of an APOM, Agile Product Operating Model and Evidence-Based Approach series of webinars. We've had ones on organization structures. We've had ones on portfolio planning. Do you need it? We've had stuff, an introduction. We've had stuff on what is a product. We've had all sorts of webinars. If you're interested in the series, click on it on scrum.org, you'll find it. For the people that don't know what APOM is, it's ultimately a way that many organizations are aligning their capabilities to provide a more holistic approach, a more value-driven approach, their capabilities in thing called products. So they could be internal products, external products, they could be shared services, but ultimately using this product mindset and this way of aligning organizations and investing to approach it in this way. We call it APOM, and there's some characteristics. unique. Each product operating model, each product has its own unique operating model. It's holistic, meaning it has all the capabilities necessary to support the people working in that operating model. Empowered teams built to continuously in that process of change. We're going to be hearing a bit of a challenge with incentives around that principle. We're going to be talking about that later. Complete, meaning you can actually deliver product capabilities from this operating model and from this team. Empirical, we never know what we know until we know it, right? So we can empirically approach the problem. And of course, evidence, particularly around value and flow, are the two mechanisms that we use to drive this operating model. So if you want more on that, go and look at one of our webinars or read. There's a white paper that's actually pretty interesting. Actually, it's probably latest stuff compared to the webinars worth going through. So APOM requires change, and I want to set the scene for the reason why we're doing an incentives webinar. And it's actually a Ken Schwaber story, one of the stories he told me, and may or may not be related to a company that Darrell worked with. I wouldn't like to say that, but maybe you can comment in a minute, Darrell, on this. But so Ken tells this story. He said he'd been doing Scrum a little while, Patient Keeper and some other stuff, but mostly working for software companies. And then a large financial services company said, we want to do this Scrum thing. We want to, and so they took Scrum and they adopted it and used it on this project that was a disaster. And I say project here because they hadn't really aligned to products yet. It happened to be a product that they were building, but they were still very much in that project mindset. And they were incredibly successful with Scrum. And Ken, likes to describe it was so successful, his daughter, it paid for his daughter's college. They were so successful, but they actually delivered a product as well, which is really, really groovy. And they were incredibly successful. And then Ken left, wasn't escorted out the building. He actually left under his own steam. And they carried on trying to do Scrum because they were incredibly successful. And why wouldn't we pick up this way of working and apply it? And they had a lot of problems afterwards. And they had lots of problems for lots of reasons. But one of those reasons Ken talks about was they have an incentive program that was, about how a significant percentage of your salary or your compensation was paid that was aligned to a set of objectives that would contradict Scrum. For instance, Scrum looks at flexibility, right? You have to do what it takes to deliver that increment. Their incentives were very much, you become the bottleneck, the specialist. You get paid to be that specialist. That's what we care about. That's what we need. That's what we promote you on. That is an incredibly important thing. The other thing is that the incentives were based on these KPIs, key performance indicators, that were defined at the start of the year. Scrum's all about change, right? And some of those things, that learning as we work, should be reflected in goals, whether it probably a sprint goal, but even updating the product goal. And ultimately, it changes how we deliver value during the sprint and during the product development life. And these key performance indicators were determined at the start of the year.
Yeah,
And ultimately, the incentives, Darrell, were totally disaligned, and it undermined their adoption. Darrell, maybe you can comment.
Yeah, just a couple things to add there, and I'll kind of try to weave in one of the questions that we have in the Q&A already, Dave, which is that change Dave talks about at the product level is one element of the change, but there's also a how we work change that's in play here. And in order to get large organizations on board with that how we work change, you need some moment. In this case, there was a very challenged project that needed to get done. So people were open to finding new ways, creating new ways to do things. So the do side of that had the urgency required to drive change in how we did. What Dave's referring to is the how we measure and how we reward didn't follow suit at the same time. But in order to get organizations ready for the kind of change, whether it's just adopting Scrum, whether it's looking at APOM holistically, there has to be a kind of motivating force beyond the it's just better. My experience is that it's just better isn't enough for the entire machine, if you will, to get ready to adopt the new approach. And having experienced waterfall, having experienced agile through different lenses throughout my career, I do believe agile's better. I wouldn't be here advising if I didn't believe agile and Scrum were better. But to get the entire organization ready for that change, to manage the risk associated with that change, because there is risk as you go through that of evolution, of learning and adopting and adapting. The teams need to have a motivator behind them, a crisis, if you will, that they're attacking. And that can be a financial crisis, that can be a delivery crisis. There's a lot of ways that that crisis can manifest itself. But the change alone, I think, for the sake of change, is a very difficult inertia to build within an organization. So
Uh,
there's the process change, and then there's of how we do work, and then there's the why and the what behind it that also needs to change. And getting that all together, we're going to talk about the why and the what a little bit here today, beyond the how. Sorry, Dave.
no worries. I think you added a lot of color to that, and as you can see, we're I hopefully we'll get through this whole deck, but we have quite a lot to say. So the point was that the incentive. So after this big reason to change, which was the incentive for the first project that was incredibly successful, it was very clear they were in a mess. Afterwards, there wasn't that incentive, and add to that the incentives on the individual incentives were not aligned to drive Scrum into the organization. And there's probably many other things as well, but that is something that Ken described. And APOM requires change, unfortunately, painfully, because we never like change. In fact, change, back in the good old days when we were living in caves and fighting woolly mammoths, that gets you killed, right? You go out the cave and you always turn left. When you turn right, saber-toothed tiger. So, but sometimes there might be more opportunity on the right, and then you have to balance that risk, right? So ultimately, it requires change, and you can see there's lots of reasons that gets in the way of that: bonus, career, reporting structure and alignment, experience, process. We're going to be talking how incentives can both undermine and underline change, meaning they can make it more effective or they can actually make it less effective. So we probably should level set on incentives, right, Darrell? Because there's a lot that word is very leveraged. So for the purposes of today's webinar, now I'm not saying I'm no expert in all of these things, though we have talked in preparation for this webinar. We've talked to a bunch of organizations that are either on the APOM path or that are ultimately not, but they're using Scrum. And so they were interesting conversations. So they talked about, or I gathered from this, and obviously ChatGPT helped a bit, tangible and intangible type incentives. The tangible ones are ones that you can see, right? They're very, well, you can see them. The other ones maybe a little bit, but they're very tangible. They're on your report card. They're on your LinkedIn profile. Well, maybe not your salary, but the position is, base salary, right? That's very tangible. You can see that every month, and it's never as much as we like, right? Short-term incentives, bonuses, commissions, profit share, those things that okay, this year we're gonna, this is you're gonna have a bonus of potentially 20%, blah, 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 based on these initiatives, etc. Long-term incentives, things like stock options and RSUs, heavily used in the startup world, right? But they're very tangible. Well, actually, in the startup word, they're tangible, but they might not actually be valuable. That's another story. And then title position, that goes back to your LinkedIn profile, right? I can put that I'm a CEO of Scrum.org, and not totally sure if people like that, but I can put it on my LinkedIn in my profile. And then there's an interesting group of incentives that we perhaps don't talk about quite as much, which are authority. I'm the authority, right? People come to me, people know I'm in charge of this thing. You cannot get this thing or you can't update RP150 without me saying you can. It gives me a certain level of, yeah, I'm important. Um, Autonomy and control. I've got control over something. I feel like I own it. Peer recognition, and these are all similar kind of intangible incentives. My peers respect me, or at least I think they do. And this, there's, oh my gosh, Dave, you're awesome. That kind of thing over and over again. Nobody ever says that, but potentially they could. And of course, things that I can put on my resume, that I passed PSM2, because we got, or I'm a PST, or I'm a, those sort of things. And perhaps, a sort of underlying idea about intangible incentives is that connection with purpose and meaning. The reason why I'm at Scrum.org isn't because of the great shirts and the like. It's because I truly want to empower people to deliver more value, and I think Scrum's a great way of doing it. That purpose and meaning is an incentive for me to get up every day. It gets me out of bed every day, and that's, I think, the reason why Darrell joined us. It certainly wasn't for the salary or short-term incentives. So this is what we're when we're talking about incentives, and I think it's important to understand tangible and intangible. And the other theme that we're going to be saying a lot is incentives exist even in companies that say we're very transparent, we have no invisible incentives, or intangible incentives. These things exist, and it's our job as change agents to make them visible and manage them accordingly. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Anything around incentives you want to add,
No,
Darrell?
I think you covered it very well, Dave, and I think we have to look at this in totality, right? Because as you think about delivery, as you think about all the things that it takes to bring a product to market, all of these come into play, and the human ego requires a balance of all of these different things. So I think you hit it very well.
Yeah, I think that totalitarist, that broad understanding I think is very important.
Yes.
So I think the reason why you're probably all on a webinar today is I think you already get this, right? The relationship between incentives and change. And so this is a combination of academic work and some of the conversations that we had, and I think Darrell gets this. We know that short-term incentives are really good at driving short-term behavior, but they're not, according to a lot of academic work, and according from my experience, they're not good at driving long-lasting change. So, so we have to think about that. Incentives can override other motivation, particularly if you're motivated to be here, but you feel that the incentive plan is taking you to do something you're not motivated to do, they can get in the way of that, right? Incentives can shift focus from meaningful work to achieving targets. It becomes all about the target and not about the actual reason why you're there in the work. And that's particular. I just want to lean into this one in a little bit more detail. So one of the biggest challenges with working in complex work is the unknown, right? We get that. That's the reason why estimation and planning so hard. That's the reason why we're working these little things called sprints. That's the reason why, etc. Now, targets ultimately mean that we have an idea of the thing that we're shooting at, right? And therefore we can say, hey, that's gone well, that's gone badly. You can imagine if we shift to achieving targets and we're working in a complex environment, we may end up, like for instance, imagine we introduce an incentive around story points, or even worse, lines of code. Well, that's great. That's a target, but ultimately it leads us to the wrong outcome, really. The other thing about incentives is if you get them wrong, it can lead to dodgy things happening, right? Volkswagen are perhaps the most high-profile example of this, right, in our industry, and particularly in software. There was a very clear incentive for delivering these series of product goals, or this one product goal around passing the admission standards, and therefore some software engineer took that and built some really cool capabilities in the car that allowed them to basically say, I'm being tested now. So it created a different level of admission, ran the engine less efficiently or more efficiently or whatever, I don't know, but generated less carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide, right? So bit unethical, right? And of course, getting them wrong, oops. So the bottom line is incentives always exist, but without careful thought, they can undermine any change that you're driving. And I think that's the theme that we're going to be talking more about that. But there's lots of work academically and in the sort of like the Brené Brown world. I'm not sure if that's academic or whatever, those books you buy that you read on the beach. And I picked just two of them, Ori Knies and Alfie Cohn. But there's lots more, and I two quotes there. I mix signals. If you want innovation and risk taking, don't send a mixed signal by punishing failure, reward them. So, how many incentive programs ultimately, both tangible and intangible, really do undermine any chance you have of being promoted or getting your bonus if you get something wrong? There was a large consumer packaged goods organization I was engaged with, and they were telling me about a sprint review that they said went wrong, and I actually thought it was the best sprint review ever. They called into question the product goal. They called into question the investment, the commitment of the stakeholders, and particularly the sponsor. They called into question many of the underlying assumptions that the product goal had allowed. That was brilliant. Wasn't so good for their managers because suddenly they've failed because they haven't just done what they're told, right? Thought it was a great sprint myself, but obviously they didn't. The other one is if I offered you $1,000 to take off your shoes, you'd very likely accept. And I could say, oh my gosh, incentives and rewards work. But as with punishments, they can never help somebody develop a commitment to a task or action, a reason to keep doing it when there's no longer a payoff. So how do you incentivize in a way, or create an environment where incentives aren't undermining the sort of behaviors that you look? Now, if you're into Skinnerian, which is really hard to say, I thought it was funny though, skin in the game, Skinnerian. Skinnerian management, you might think that, and maybe your bosses think, and your bosses' bosses think this, the idea that punishment, reinforcement, punishment, and extinction, which is basically rewards and punishment basically, and reinforcement is rewards. Extinction is taking a reward that you used to give away. Is a great way of managing teams. Don't talk just code. Come on, they're coin operated. Those people. There's consequences driven past behavior influence future behavior, clear expectations. There are some benefits to this way of thinking about it because everybody knows what's happening. It's a very systemic approach, but ultimately it does not work. It's manipulative, dehumanizing, demotivates intrinsic motivation. It's very short-termistic, usually does not work for complex tasks where the outcome is actually more is measurable, but measurable in a either longer term manner, or there's a lot of measures to get to that measure, meaning there's, for instance, we're releasing a new set of capabilities on a website. We have interim measures of, has people clicked on it, etc. Revenue is our long-term goal. It makes it very hard to do stuff like that. And of course, if you just focus on that sort of reward punishment, it's very hard to sort of define that the why, as it were, which is crucial to all of us in the way that we work. So the bottom line is, and this can be as no surprise, so I probably said nothing that shocked you. So the bottom line is that if you're working in a product group, ultimately you're aligned to that product and the outcomes of that product. That they're hopefully being described in terms of goals. Goal is a key word because just like in soccer, There's a line, and you can see where the ball goes over it. Now, particularly as we have all, the electronics to support that. There was many days when I was young where there was goals. Frank Lampard almost scored one in an England against Germany game. He did score. Nobody saw it, and it was on clearly that it was over the line. But hopefully, you've got goals with clear measures and associated with them, and the product group is moving to them, and it does so in a flexible way. Teams are empowered to actually look at the how and make decisions about how they're making progress towards it. They're cross-functional, meaning they've got all the skills necessary to deliver the value. They're self-managed. They're making choices. Nobody's telling them what to do. They're making those choices themselves, and they are empowered enough to be able to do all of that. And flexible is a key way. Now, if that is the product team or teams, if you're in a group and we're moving towards those goals, you can see that when you look at them in a large organization, often you'll see things starting to pull them away from this clearly aligned product group moving towards an outcome. And that's maybe status. Well, I need to get a profile, and I need to work on a high profile thing, and I need to do all this extra stuff that's nothing to do with the product group. Authority. Oh, well, if I work on, if I work in a cross-functional team and my entire job is to help other people be successful, I'm not going to have any authority over anything. And again, that won't help me long term. It's not going to help me get promoted if the team does well. It's going to help me get promoted if I do well. And of course, individual KPIs that set at the start of the year, or even more frequently than that, can get in the way of me working as a good teammate. Hang on, my job is to score goals. I'm not coming back and playing in that midfield area. How many strikers have we heard say that? Particularly if you listen to Roy Kent, for instance, if you're a Ted Lasso fan. So, Jamie Tart came back and actually passed the ball to somebody else, if you're a Ted Lasso fan, and helped. Hey, Darrell, anything to add to this bottom line?
Well, I think, Dave, that the key here is managing and being cognizant of the fact that those kind of red distractors, I'll call them, they're bigger than distractors, exist. And you have to think about both your tangible, your intangible incentives in context of the fact that those are real. A lot of those are human driven needs. So you can't ignore the fact that authority matters to individuals, that promotion matters to individuals. So the message here isn't to just focus in the middle and goals and you'll be good. The message here is you have to understand the whole ecosystem. You have to understand how these forces are at play in your organization. And then you have to be able to think through what the right incentives are to drive the outcomes that you are hoping to drive through the product team. So it's really about awareness too, not necessarily ignorance of those other forces. You cannot take those out of the human ego.
And I think that's the important point. I was talking to a mid-size, I think what's it called, a scale-up startup, and I was talking to one of their founders, and really interesting chap, right? And they have a mission that is medical. So and I can't say too much because otherwise you'll know who they are. They've got a mission that if they deliver on it, will have massive implications to us as we grow older, have huge implications to mankind as a whole. And very clear. And he said to me, I asked him about this, and he said, when I started naively, when we started the company, and the first group of people joined, we were all aligned to this mission, and everything else was irrelevant. We didn't care about anything. Yeah, we had a fair stock plan, RSU plan, and everything else, salary, you just did enough. You gave enough salary that we could afford, and we're all very transparent, and it was all great, and everybody was moving in the same direction. And as we grew, now there are about 300 people or so, 400 people. I just assumed that would scale, right? Easy, right? And I realized after a while, when people started, we brought in from Big Pharma and some other companies, that wasn't the case. And I had to sit back and go, so job title matters. Didn't think it did. Status matters, authority matters. We have to start thinking about a promotion structure. And this perhaps many of you in the Agile community are like, well, senior Scrum Master. I've always been like, what does that really mean? Or Agile Coach is a progression from Scrum Master, or Senior Product Owner, Vice President Product Owner. The bottom line is that you can't assume that everybody is aligned to this very simple and very clear set of goals around the product. And everybody has their other needs. And also there's a level of trust here. And I was talking to this founder and he said, yeah, and I realized that though on some level they all kind of trusted me and us and where we were going, they also realized that stuff happens, right? So they have to kind of look after themselves as well on this journey. And he goes, and I have to accept that. So how do we build an incentive model that actually accepts all of these, but really keeps us aligned to delivering on the product goals, because the product goals are so important. I thought that was quite interesting perspective. Can't talk about incentives without talking about motivation, and we can't talk about motivation without Dan Pink. The surprising truth that motivates you. If you haven't read the book, you don't need to. Just watch the TED Talk. That's all you need. So I'm not saying it's a really good book. It's just a lot of examples in it. So Dan Pink talks about the surprising truth for intrinsic motivation that motivates us is autonomy, mastery, purpose, right? Talks about the importance of those three elements when you're building a plan, when you're building a team, when you're building an environment for those teams to succeed. Short-term, he talks about a little bit about incentives provide short-term motivational pushes to get people working in the same direction, maybe if they don't trust that that direction is going to be correct. He also talks about the fact that you can undermine any of those three things with the wrong incentives. And ultimately, any incentive can affect the long term where we're going. And it's almost impossible to redirect after this. So incentives, goals, vision, mission, personal goals, career growth can confuse and blur what we are focused on. So simple is perhaps the most important message. Considering autonomy, mastery, purpose, and making any approach that we have incredibly simple. And simple is really where startups live, right? When I was working at TaskTop as chief product officer, we had a very simple approach to everything. Yes, people were worrying about those intangible incentives, but our tangible incentives were incredibly simple. Salary, enough to get the talent. That's pretty much when it was always never enough, right? So we had to use the power of personality. You want to come and work with Dave West? No, nobody really did. We had options, RSUs, that everybody on the same goal. Those, the company needed to grow with that. And we actually introduced short-term bonuses to really incentivize behavior on particular goals that we needed to track against, particularly for our VCs and investors. It was simple, clear, transparent. Now, that's for the tangible incentives. There was a bunch of intangibles that we had to manage as good managers, which was challenging. So, Darrell, this is the small startup type of world. What about in big companies? You've got this example of how in a big company you tried to take that model and implement it.
So my product journey in the software world started in 2007. And the challenge at that time, rewinding nearly 20 years now, the challenge at that time was a lot of fintech startups taking little nibbles of capability around everything we were trying to do. And the question that came to us as IT leadership was, how do we think differently? We need to be able to compete with these fintech startups because clearly they're delivering to market and setting the bar for market expectations on what capabilities can be. And we need to compete at scale with our existing competition. So how do we think differently? How do we get to a place that we can do that more effectively as a business and starting with the IT organization? So we took this approach of how do you build small business accountability, and we stayed away from the word startup candidly because it's not just a startup thing. It's anytime you have a small group of people working towards a common outcome. How do you think about that? And so we looked at what does it really mean to have a small business accountability? And we assessed, do we have the right value driven approach within that small business, within that what we termed IT product? Do we know what the value prop is? First and foremost, is this going to be a differentiator for our business, or is this a commodity play for our business? That's a huge decision that needed to be made around what is the posture of this and the fundamental value of this capability of this IT product. How is it aligned to success? How are we defining that, and how do we create urgency for the team around that success? Because it's really important in a large organization that you can bring reality down to every associate on what their contribution means to the overall success. Pride and ownership. When you're in a small business, doesn't matter if you're working at a general store on Main Street or if you're working at a large company on a product. Do you have pride and ownership? Is the thing that you're bringing to market something that you can turn to your family and say, I'm excited about what we're going to deliver, and here's why? And is it clear that why? And Dave talked a lot about Dan Pink. I could just as easily talk about Simon Sinek, right? Is the why clear? Does everybody understand? Does that resonate with them? Can they get their feet on the ground every morning and be excited about why they're going to work today and why they're delivering the value they're delivering? And how, as an organization, do you use small business accountability to enable that within the teams? So if we go to the next slide, the model that we came up with, and this is just one model, there are many, we've talked to many companies who are looking at different models. And it's been updated from 2007 because OKRs really weren't the way people talked about this in 2007 so much. OKRs have certainly been around longer than that, but from a penetration of the market, OKRs are relatively new in the last 5 to 8 years as a common way. But do you have your OKRs aligned correctly? I'll go back to the Volkswagen example Dave used. The OKR, the objective was right. Have a internal combustion engine using diesel fuel that could meet emission standards. That's a great objective. The problem was the KRs were misaligned as to how you got there and how you proved that. And there's some ethics that came into play there as well. But you didn't have the right KRs measuring whether you were actually getting there the right way, right? So you have to have good OKRs. If a team is delivering together towards that OKR, they either get there, they either make those KRs, they make that objective happen, or they don't. And that first 30% of their incentive model is purely based on whether or not they collectively got there, and they get the same value point out of that 30. The next is from the product owner. How did each individual on the team contribute to the product goals? How much value did they bring? Everybody doesn't bring the same value for a variety of reasons. We all have personal lives, we all have distractions, we all have other things going on. Maybe I'm a shared resource across two products. I know that's heresy, but it happens. And so maybe my contribution to one product wasn't as much as it could have been because I was too busy working on another product. So the next kind of third 30 value points is associated to my contribution to the product. Then the opposite side of that coin is my value contribution to my functional discipline, whatever that is. If I'm a data engineer, if I'm a UX designer, whatever the case may be, especially in cases where I may have to be spread across multiple initiatives, multiple product teams. My functional manager, because not every product organization is a hierarchy, is a structural organization. My functional manager has a point of view on the next 30 points, which is regardless of how the product perceived me, the product team perceived my contribution, what was my contribution to my functional discipline? So I can get a little bit of balance there. 10%, 10 value points always comes down to corporate initiatives in a large organization. You have all kinds of different compliance things and security related items, other things that you have to contribute to and are measured. So you have to leave some room in there. But what this allowed us to do is really get a healthy balance of the individual contribution to the product, which equates to 60%, 60 value points of your contribution, as well as your individual success, which also comes down to 60 value points between your functional discipline and your product contribution. So you kind of get a little bit of a balance here, or a lot of balance, around product aligned outcomes as well as functional discipline. The individual can relate to how their results ladder up to an objective, ladder up to strategy, and feel that purpose and that why come through and how they're measured as part of the organization.
Hmm. That's
So
interesting.
there's a lot here. Tried to do it relatively quickly. And again, this is one balanced accountability model. There are many other ways to go about this, but this has had some success in organizations.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Darrell. So ultimately, this idea, taking out the corporate initiatives for a minute, which is have you attended those compliance things and been a good citizen and the like. The three things are basically functional. So am I a good tester? Am I a good business analyst? Am I a good software developer? Whatever those competency functional areas are. And then 30% is just as a team of teams for a product, have we delivered that on those objectives, those OKRs that we needed? And then what's my contribution to that as determined by the product owner? And so that's the model, right, Darrell? Those three things.
Yeah, and around this, just there was one question that came in around stakeholders, Dave. So I just want to hit that. The stakeholders are really the negotiation between the product owner and the corporate strategy. So that stakeholder group around that is looking to the product owner. The product owner has been the mission has been declared, the vision has been declared as critical or important to the enterprise. So the product owner holds that and is accountable to really think through the stakeholder engagement as you go
Sorry.
down that path.
Yeah.
Go
It's,
ahead, Dave.
it's it's interesting. I probably think this is, if I was going to critique it, and obviously there's smarter people than me that have critiqued it, and I can see how it was necessary in an organization the size that you're working, is that I think it's overly complex. I think I like the idea of product, but I don't think the individual contribution and the product oversight, I think those two could be combined, and maybe the functional area, maybe not. I can see the reason why you would do that. One of the organizations I was talking to basically separates, you get promoted for your functional delivery, how good you are at your craft as determined by your peers, and your bonus is determined by the product. It's as simple as that. And that they have that literally of the promotion bit, meaning how far you go up the levels, and then the product bit, meaning every year the in terms of tangible. That's how they work, which is a version of this, though a little bit more
Yeah,
simplified.
I think the one thing that we were really trying to emphasize here, Dave, was the shift of a hero mentality
Yeah,
to a team success mentality. And that first 30 that I talked about, that overall product success, the reason that got broken out, while it adds complexity, was simply to drive that team success and that focus on team success. So just because I'm a software engineer or a database engineer or a UX designer, if the critical step right now is testing, I need to put down my pencil and go and do some testing because the product to get to market needs some more testing, right? Whatever the case may be from a skills, if I can add value in a different way outside
yeah,
of
yeah,
my functional discipline, we wanted to be able to incent that everybody together owns a piece of the product success.
yeah, yeah. I think it's an interesting model.
So not to
So
defend it too much.
not that you're defending it. And by the way, nothing's right. And this is the other thing that I've learned from talking to a bunch of organizations around incentives. This is really hard because we talked about these, we've been talking about tangible things. But the reality is there's also a bunch of intangibles that aren't on that 30-30-10, 30-30-30-10, that also get in the way. So this is hard. People are complicated. And every year I realize this. I think that's the benefit of old age, right? And then at a point you sort of like, I don't care. And you just ignore it, which you become like the grumpy guys on the Muppet Show. But anyway, here's some principles for success. And I think this is from what I've learn, and these might not be perfect, and I think all of you on this webinar can probably improve this, but it's certainly, I think, in the right direction. Incentives are unique to the individual. Understand what a tangible and intangible incentives are for that person. You've got, Darrell shared the 30-30-30-10 model, and then looking at, okay, so what authority and status and peer recognition, how does that fit? Resume building, where does that fit in this thing? Let's start, and they're individual based. Some people care very deeply about the tangible things, and they're the people that always want to make the most money and get the promotion. And there's some people that are more intangible. I really care about how my peers recognize me. Different people, different needs, right? Simple, transparent, tangible incentives. Darrell just painted you a really, I think could be simpler, but let's go with it. A simple, transparent, tangible set of incentives. Product goals, as you saw, they were 30% of his tangible incentives, must be part of the incentive in some way, the tangible incentives. Otherwise, it defeats the whole. If it just wrecks everything. Team incentives should be more important than individual incentives. Now that you could criticize maybe that model that where it was all about the individual, but I also see why people would want that. If you're the only, I remember in university, I made the mistake one semester of working with the people I liked the most. Rob, Justin, and Mark, right? They were my busy mates. We used to go out drinking. We used to go to the Hacienda. We used to in Manchester and have a great time, right? Turns out that I was Mr. Square, they thought, and working hard, and they expected me to continue that. So they just backed off and I did most of the work. I was really annoyed that they got exactly the same mark on that group assignment. But I learned from that and never worked with them again, though they are, a couple of them are still very, very good friends. Maybe they listen to this webinar. I don't know. Anyway, individual incentives is president should focus on helping others, flexibility and building skills. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. I want to zoom in on that. And then, of course, there's going to be short-term and long-term goals for anything that we work on. And we need to think about those sprints, product goal, and the overall product vision, right? So we're working on those things. So a quick word about FAIR, and I'd love your perspective on this, Darrell. FAIR. FAIR is very subjective, not very objective, unfortunately. FAIR is all about how I perceive something. So I've spent a lot of time talking about whether salaries should be visible, everybody's salary. So we have that clear, balanced scorecard. Everybody knows what everybody earns, position, etc. But then when you try to do that, you don't necessarily communicate all the nuances. This person lives in New York and we need to incentivize. Oh, so I have to put a city rate on that. Okay, so that makes it fair. Oh, but they chose to live there. Does that make it fair? You get into these really, really complicated debates with people about what fair is. Fair and equitable aren't necessarily the same thing as well, which makes it even more complicated. So from my experience, follow your own gut and your own moral compass, be able to sleep at night about the models that you implement, but don't expect everybody to think of it as fair. Darrell, you've probably had multiple discussions with associates and people that work with you about, well, that's not fair. I did a lot more on that project, so I should be rewarded more, or, et cetera, et cetera.
And as you said, it's subjective. It's relative to the information you have, right? And depending on which side of the table you're having the conversation from, the amount of information you have and the context you bring is different. So fair on one context can be easily perceived as unfair through a different context. And it's nearly impossible to it actually is impossible in my experience with legal constraints and other things to level the playing field of context for every associate in a large organization. So you have to do, to your point, Dave, you have to do the best that you can to bring forward the context that is manageable, and share how decisions get made around that context. But it's never going to be perfect. At least I don't see a path today that will give you 100% confidence that everything you do is fair. And by the way, we're still all humans. Management is humans, human resources humans, individual associates are humans. So we're all going to have implicit biases that we may or may not even understand at any given time, and that's all part of the context.
I think from my experience, when you're looking at visible and invisible or tangible and intangible incentives, and you're looking at how it's influencing the behavior of the product teams, I try to go in with an open mind. I try to be fair to the principles that I bring to the table. And at the end of the day, realize that it's never going to be perfect. And that is just the reality, fortunately. So, new bottom line. People are very, very complex. I had to use that picture because it was super cute. I discovered it. Um, so because of that, now, the Hawthorne effect notwithstanding, which the whole, remember the Hawthorne effect, the factory somewhere in America that put light bulbs in, saw productivity go up, took light bulbs out, productivity continued to go up because people were paying attention to it. So there is some impact on that of you thinking about this, but I think people, and I would encourage HR to use an empirical agile process when looking at the tangible incentives in an organization. So each product operating model is obviously unique. That gives us, for that product, an opportunity to try different tangible incentive models for that particular product. And then understanding their effect on the system and the people that are playing it, build new goals based on that and experiment with ideas. Now, the biggest reason why organizations don't do this is for some of those tangible incentives, they have monetary privacy implications, right? As Darrell talked about on fairness. So it can be incredibly hard. So that's the reason why we should always partner with this people that know this stuff, which is HR. Partnering with HR in building your operating model for your products is crucial, and thinking about incentives, both tangible and intangible. It's the only way to work. With respect to APOM, and I'm conscious of time, so I want to make sure we have time for a couple of questions. Why is it important for APOM? What we don't want to do is undermine flexibility, risk taking, and the empirical kind of nature of agile product operating models. Cross-functional, people should do what it takes to deliver, even if that means they have to get outside their comfort zone, which increases the risk, which increases their profile, and increases the likelihood of failure. And as Darrell talked about earlier, focused on that goal, that OKR with respect to the 30-30-30-10 model. We also need to think about, that what we want and what we need to encourage in organizations is this T-shaped, comb-shaped, whatever shape thing, where the cross thing is really this good understanding of context and business. And so we need to encourage everybody to care about the domain that they're working in somehow. The other thing that's really interesting is I'm going to mention the Spotify model, but this idea of a guild and chapter. One thing that I was really intrigued about in Spotify, and I don't really know where this went, but it kind of like tickled my fancy, is this idea, and this was a conversation I had with somebody else as well, that talked about the separation of talent management from product management, meaning product or the work management. And this idea that you could get promoted and achieve mastery and by helping others, by developing these skills and building an entire sort of like two sides to the coin, and allowing people to progress and allowing people to have tangible incentives on both sides. One about helping the organization be more flexible and deliver more value and more skill and develop, helping others get better at their craft, and one delivering amazing products every day. So that's something, this enabling team idea in team topologies is something that's worth exploring. These metrics are key. Think about them, think about how they fit in to those OKRs and to those, or that product value that you're driving. particularly around those EBM, evidence-based management type metrics of UV, CV, A2I, and T2M. They're particularly important. I personally think that flow metrics are the province of retrospectives and continuous improvement, and not something that, but sometimes you have to incentivize, right, to change behavior. So maybe. Now, getting the summary. Gosh, we had so much to talk about, and two people, always a problem. So I apologize for that. Okay, if you're going to take away three-ish things. One, incentives exist, even if you say, no, we're a totalitarian, loving, caring organization. They exist, and they can undermine anything that you do. Tangible and intangible. Even if the tangibles are incredibly simple, you're going to find those intangibles, and they are potentially could undermine. Think about incrementally removing negative incentives. Now, this means something that's fundamentally going to be challenging in most organizations, that the incentive model is going to the tangible incentive model is going to change. But make that impact transparent, use a systems approach, and use measures, obviously, that are visible and transparent to everybody. APOM success is about people. So you have to think about the people. Think holistically about them. And those damn incentive models are going to have to change. And most organizations don't want to do that. And that makes it very, very hard. Okay. Wow. We're almost at time, Darrell. Have we got time for maybe one question?
I've been watching, Dave. There's a litany of questions that we can certainly try to put a blog out post fact around answering some of them, so we can work on that and try to get that. One question that I'll ask you, Dave, if I could, just because I think it's an interesting question that has a little bit to do with incentives, a little bit to do with APOM, and a little bit to do with some of the things we've seen across the Scrum Master Agile Coach community. And I'd love to get your thoughts on it, which is, what do you think about companies who let coaches and Scrum Masters define their own annual and quarterly goals? Sounds interesting, but it doesn't feel, I'll paraphrase here, it doesn't feel complete, and I can't actually put my finger on why it's not complete. Do you have any thoughts on those people defining their own goals?
I think it depends on how those goals ultimately are agreed upon. I think ultimately a goal, if somebody's paying you for something, and assuming you're not working for yourself, but if somebody is ultimately paying you for something, then it's important that any goals that are agreed, and I'm not sure about annual goals, by the way. I'm not sure if they even make sense nowadays, because I know many of the things I'm focused on now at Scrum.org were not in my plan a year ago, which is very annoying. But quarterly probably is the domain that I would focus on. I would ensure that those goals that we're working on ultimately are signed off, or at least transparently shared with stakeholders, particularly people that are paying for your time and investing in you, in doing something, delivering a product, etc. So I like people taking responsibility for defining the goals for themselves. I think that's a really powerful thing. But I also think that it has to be with others. And the other word of warning. So we had a process for our undergraduate thesis for our honors degrees in England, where you define the markings criteria. Now, I'm Mr. I want to do everything because I am the square guy. That's the reason why Rob and Mark and Justin worked with me. So I built this incredibly hard, comprehensive marking scheme, which basically marked me down at the end of the year because my aspirations were more than I could deliver on. And they, my friends, God love them, they didn't do that. Theirs was relatively simple. And my mentor, my tutor, said to me, you know, you'd have got a first for that dissertation if you'd have just made it much easier to mark. And I was like, ah. So one thing, some people naturally define goals that are almost unobtainable, and that can undermine their ability to be motivated by it. So that's from my experience. I think, yes, love people taking ownership of their own destiny. They have to then work with the people that are paying for that destiny or involved in that destiny in some way.
Thanks.
Well, we're at time. Can you believe it? There's so much to talk about. I love Darrell's idea. There's going to be a blog on this. I can commit to that because I'm going to make this a goal for Darrell. And he'll make me do it. So thank you for joining today. Hopefully you've learned something, or at least you may not have learned something, but it's at least reminded you of things you already knew. I really appreciate you taking the time. And thank you, Darrell, for joining me today. And thank you, everybody. Stay in touch. APOM's kind of interesting. If you're interested in APOM, go to the website, sign up for the content, see that content.